Hold on to your hats and wallets. The Florida legislature is about to convene. Guns, gambling, taxes, and so much more on their agenda.
There's a $1 billion reduction in taxes.
The governor has those priorities, but it sounds like lawmakers may have other ideas.
We do not do business with countries, okay? We do business with carriers.
The Miami-Dade mayor draws a line as the county makes way for ferry service to Cuba. We will take it to the roundtable.
A lot to talk about today. Good morning and welcome. So great to have you aboard this morning.
And we are glad to have Glenna back and for you to be spending part of your Sunday with us. We begin today with the Florida legislature. On Tuesday, the legislature convenes for its regular session. This is about 2 months earlier than usual. But as usual, lawmakers' desks will be covered with flowers. There will be smiles and hugs. But don't expect the good times to last long in Tallahassee.
Lawmakers have a lot of ground to cover. The budget is the big one, but no doubt the great debate begins over what you're looking at right there. Guns and weapons. The first bills ready to go allow Floridians with concealed weapons permits to carry those openly and bring them on state university and college campuses as well.
Representative Carlos Trujillo is a Republican who represents Doral, parts of West Miami-Dade, and also part of Collier County. He chairs the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee and voted in favor of these gun bills in committee.
Representative Jose Javier Rodriguez is a Democrat who represents Coral Gables, Key Biscayne, and downtown Miami. He is the ranking Democrat on the House Finance and Tax Committee. Good morning to both of you. Thanks so much.
Representatives, great to have you come in.
On the way to Tallahassee.
Exactly.
Representative Trujillo, you voted for the open carry, campus carry bills. I don't, frankly, hear a huge public outcry for either of these bills, but there is sentiment in the legislature. Why do you support them?
Well, I support both. Let's take them one by one. The open carry, it's allowed in 45 states. It's for law-abiding citizens who currently have their concealed weapons permit. Instead of having to holster them and keep them hidden, they will be allowed to carry them in the open. Yeah. As far as the campus carry, it's also for individuals who are at least 21 years old, meet the background requirements, and are allowed to have weapons in all places except for universities. Florida State University, almost 10% of the student population are veterans. These people who've served our country honorably will be able to carry.
And Florida State University President John Thrasher, a conservative Republican, is dead set against it. He, the faculty presidents of every state university believe that this is not a good idea. What do you say to them?
Well, we've had a lot of students, more students come in favor than against it. A lot of young women who've come and said that they feel much safer with firearms on campus. A lot of young men who've served our military have come and spoken in support. So besides the faculty and some of the presidents, the outcrying is a lot more from the student body and even from some of the local sheriffs and chief of police.
Representative, you voted no in committee on the bills. Is this, I guess the big question is it a solution looking for a problem?
I think I would accept that characterization. I'm very much opposed to these proposals. One would ask, you know, as I think you were referencing, whether this is about policy or it's about politics. I mean, for me, as the representative did, I will take them one by one. I mean, one proposal would allow concealed weapons. Again, you have to be 21. You have to, you have to have a license or permit to carry a weapon. But it would allow them in dorms and classrooms. And I don't know that that's something that, again, there's an outcry for. Universities and colleges are universally opposed to it. Student government representatives, the representative mentioned FSU, are opposed to it, have been heavily lobbying us, again on their own, so not all of them make it up to Tallahassee to committee meetings. The second proposal, again, is about openly carrying firearms. So those who already have a permit, they would be able to openly carry their weapons.
Yeah, this is strapping a gun on a holster on your hip.
It's
in
not
public, but on the other hand, there are still exceptions to this. Some stores, some businesses can post signs, I guess, and say you are not allowed to openly carry heavy gun on the premises.
Well, I would take issue. It is not about holstering a weapon, and that's part of the problem with the proposal.
What's it about?
The representative mentions that other states do have open carry. Oklahoma, for example, you have to holster your weapon. There's a greater training requirement than we have in the state of Florida. So, for example, when you ask law enforcement how they would deal with a situation of an individual with a weapon in their hand, a firearm in their hand, they're permitted, walking down the middle of the sidewalk, maybe even in the middle of the street, You know, not to mention if they were holding it up in the air or near their head, if they were just literally walking with it in their hand on the sidewalk. Does that constitute a reckless display of a firearm? They don't know, because the legislation is so poorly written, it doesn't require holstering.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I think
could that
in
be
addition,
amended?
Well, the legislation was recently amended, and it will be presented to the complete Judiciary Committee with a holster requirement. Okay. There has to be a certain type Class 3 holster that has a locking mechanism on it, and the firearm must be holstered at all times. Yeah. So that part of the bill is being addressed.
Good.
You know, it's such a great debate every time somebody brings up gun bill, whether it's on the federal or state level, and everybody has the same goal, really. It's not about control, it's about gun safety. What about these bills makes anyone safer? Isn't that the goal, and what do these bills offer in the way of safety?
Well, the majority of crimes are crimes of opportunity. So I think if individuals have the right to defend themselves, and individuals who aren't acting accordingly see people who are properly able and willing to defend themselves, there is a natural deterrent to crime. If you look at places that have these strict gun-free zones and gun control, Chicago, for example, look at the amount of handgun deaths that they experience. So I think if you try to disarm law-abiding citizens, the results is what you'll experience in some of these gun control cities.
I understand. I would note that for 6 years I lived in Washington, D.C., which for a long time had extremely strict gun control measures on sale, who could buy them. And the alternative was criminals and people who wanted to sell guns simply went to Virginia, where it was easy to buy a gun. So I guess people in Chicago who have ill intent with weapons go to Indiana, where it's easy to buy a gun, I think, as the president pointed out Thursday night on that CNN town hall meeting.
Well, as long as, just lastly on this subject, what's going on in the inner cities in South Florida, all over the state, all over the country, nothing in these gun bills would ever prevent something like the murders that are happening here. Those are all illegal guns. Many of them are war machines, automatic weapons. So where is the thought of really focusing on the problem of illegal guns?
I would agree with you. I'm not an extremist. I look at these proposals. Are they the end of the world? No. Are they extremely bad and dangerous policy? Yes. But why don't we use this energy to try to address exactly that? The use of weapons and guns in deaths. And I don't see anything in these proposals that does anything other than, to be honest with you, scare my constituents. And that honestly is not what we should be doing with the limited time and energy we have in Tallahassee. We should be focusing on safety and not pandering in politics.
All right, well, let's move on, if we can, to a couple of other really big issues that you and your 118 other members of the House and 40 members of the Senate are going to cope with. And one of them is taxes. It's always an issue. This year, Governor Rick Scott says he wants a $1 billion permanent recurring tax cut. In fact, I asked him about it on Tuesday when he was in Fort Lauderdale. Let's listen to his answer. Well, Governor, Senate, and House leaders, your fellow Republicans, are indicating they're very reluctant to give this $1 billion tax cut you're asking for. How are you going to bring them around?
Michael, just think about why we're doing this. We need more jobs. You know, we've had a big turnaround in our economy. We have 300,000 job openings, but we need more jobs and we need to diversify our economy.
Well, it wasn't exactly responsive to the question when he talks about jobs, which he often does. But what about this, Representative Rodriguez? I mean, are you disposed to say, okay, we're going to permanently cut $1 billion in taxes?
I think there's several fundamental problems with the governor's proposal. Unfortunately, other Republican governors have governed, right? They've gotten in the mix. They've tried to elaborate proposals. This governor seems to govern by press release. And where he's going to find $1 billion when our projected surplus is $635 million, you really scratch your head. And I think there are really two fundamental problems. One is that a lot of where the governor wants to put the money is under this idea of jobs without really backing up how he's going to do that. The other thing is a really decided change in terms of how we fund public education that the governor's doubling down on. Local money is property tax, state money is sales tax, and we're relying more and more and more on local property taxes to pay for
What is
education.
the required local effort tax? I mean, he wants more money for education, but he wants local school districts to pay most of it.
Exactly. And that's part of the problem with this $1 billion, is that we really need to address that. That shift to funding the locals, because otherwise $1 billion in tax cuts is not. It's increasing our property taxes and then divvying out sales tax largely to well-connected corporate interests.
What's the chicken and the egg? I think the surplus is because there are rising property taxes because of rising property values right now. But the cycle has shown that that is not going to be for a forever trend.
Well, that's correct. So property values have increased, but that does not account for the shift. So for example, the governor's proposal says that there's an increase of $476 million in education. 50 million of that is state money. The rest, almost 90%, is local money, and the trajectory has been that. It used to be that for every $3 of state money there was 2 local. If the governor has his way, it's over 50% local money, and that's a dangerous trend.
Excuse me, Representative Trujillo, is the governor's tax idea here sort of DOA? I mean, it doesn't sound like you or the Republican leadership is very is supportive.
I think Republicans are supportive, especially in the House, of tax cuts, but for a purpose. I think just blanket billion-dollar tax cuts, we ultimately, how do we limit the size of government?
Right.
And that should be the goal, and that's what we're focused on.
What about, he also wants $250 million for Enterprise Florida, which tries to lure businesses and other states to come to Florida, many of which, frankly, it seems to me, would come here anyway because we have no state income tax and the weather is great. I mean, are you in favor of $250 million for Enterprise Florida?
I'm not. I don't think the state should not get in the business of picking winners and losers. I think the free market should work. I think what the state should do is, as you said, is limit regulation, limit taxes, and give businesses the ability to come here and prosper.
Yeah.
On that note, can we take a quick break and pick up right there when we come back? Stay with us. Welcome back. We are talking preview of the state legislative session with Representatives Carlos Trujillo and Jose Javier Rodriguez. And one of the big deals also, there's so many big deals coming up on Tuesday, the gambling compact that the governor just came to an agreement with the Seminole tribe, $3 billion in proceeds to the state over the next 7 years. If this goes down, and it's already expired, the last one is expired, so the time is there, and we've learned in the commercial break that neither of you are going to be voting for this compact. So, Representative, why not, and what happens without one?
Well, I think when it comes to gaming, there are 3 things that are really important. One, and I think the representative and I share this position, that I'm completely against the massive expansion of gaming that would happen with a destination resort. I think primarily for economic reasons. I just think it would be disastrous. The second thing is that we already have gambling in the state. We really ought to have some form of regulating it better. And a third thing, in my view, and I think we were talking about this at the break, the amount of bandwidth and energy that gets spent on gaming in Tallahassee, to me, is outsized. And why? Because of all the contributions and all the money spinning around. And unfortunately, there's a lot of our colleagues who spend a lot of time dealing with the intricacies of gaming and who gets blackjack and who gets this and who gets that.
A lot of stakeholders.
When there's a lot of pressing issues we should be spending our money on, but we aren't, frankly, because there's a lot of money spinning around, and that's unfortunate.
Well, the lobbyists, there's an army of lobbyists. Representative Trujillo, when I looked into sort of the deal, and just to give you some of the highlights, you're quite familiar with this, but the Seminole tribe would get an average of 3,000 slot machines at each of its 7 facilities, and could put up to 6,000 slot machines at one. And they also are able to add craps and roulette. I mean, we're talking about full-fledged Las Vegas-style gambling, and I mean, a revenue of $3 billion is certainly something the state could use, but do we really need this added gambling?
Absolutely not. If you look at what they're getting and what they're giving, it's a very bad deal for Floridians. I don't think any expansion of gambling is ever in the best interest of the state. You look currently at the Seminoles, their casino in Tampa is the highest grossing casino in the United States of America. Very, very few people know that. They think it's all in Las Vegas. It's actually, they're in Tampa, Florida. What the state's getting is roughly $300 to $350 million a year. The social ills and the consequences of the local businesses closing, the black eye we're going to take to our tourism industry, and all the bad that comes with gambling is absolutely not worth the revenue that we will be making.
But Representative, that was the argument way back when, especially in Miami-Dade, when Miami-Dade voters decided to okay gambling, and those numbers really have not come to pass.
I think they're hard to quantify. You know, yesterday I went to Publix with my family, and as we're waiting in line to pay for food, there's 50 people waiting to buy Powerball.
No, Powerball is not a state
well, it's run by the lottery.
It's run by the lottery, but we have to look at how do we start retracting on some of the spending, and who spends? Who buys lotto tickets? Look at the demographic information. Individuals, a lot of them whom don't have disposable income, and they're spending their limited resources on lottery rather than feeding or providing for their families.
So what happens, worth it to say that the Seminole tribe has rights given to them by IGRA, the federal bureau that oversees Indian affairs. What happens without a compact? The Seminoles have so many rights that they can go ahead with, and literally the state gets nothing.
This is, I think, the difficulties. The Seminoles want is consistency. And what's difficult for them is how do you build and expand, and how do you go to a traditional financing institution without any sort of consistency in the law? So what they're looking for us is something that they can later on take to Goldman Sachs, to Wall Street, and say, this is what we have. How do you create a revenue stream that'll finance these projects? Without us giving them that consistency, their business will continue to make money, but they're operating in a gray area that makes it very difficult for the long term.
And the Seminoles are a sovereign nation, right? So in order for the Florida to be able to derive revenue from what they're doing and limit what they're doing, we have to negotiate a compact. So I think the concept of negotiating a compact, I think, is wise, because it allows us to have revenue, limit gaming in the state, because it gives them exclusivity to do certain things, and we can limit that. But I think the problem is the governor's proposal is so poorly thought out. I mean, what the governor is coming to us with, to be honest with you, my sense is it's dead on arrival. And part of the problem is, again, it comes back to the issue of, is the governor really governing? He hasn't sort of involved the legislature on what he was doing. He just sort of announced it, excuse me. And sort of when the legislature looks at it, they sort of see, well, these are the interests that are very close to the governor. They seem to win under this compact. So it clearly is just a handout to lobbyists. So I don't think it's even a starting point for the legislature, in my view. The
governor, frankly, his political instincts are better, but this week you all are gathering for 60 days, and in my view, I would think the place to be for him would be in Tallahassee, but he's going to take a statewide bus tour, 1,000,000 miles for 1,000,000 jobs, and say, wow, look at all the jobs we've created, and that's his right, but you know, he might be better spending his time in Tallahassee trying to twist a few arms. Representative Trujillo, before we run out of time, let me ask you, in 2014, as you well know, 72% of Floridians said we support Amendment 1. We want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars preserving fragile, environmentally sensitive land, and frankly, nothing has been done. Now, is this the year that Amendment 1 gets enacted? I mean, money is set aside, hundreds of millions?
Well, I disagree with nothing being done. We spend tens of millions, if not $100 million, in maintaining state lands and in building water infrastructure projects. This year,
there was some. I will concede I may have overstated it, but I mean, if $700 or $800 million was available through the taxing mechanism, $100 million.
I don't believe 700 or 800 million were available. I think the number is a lot less than that. But I think what we're going to focus on this year is part of the proposals are the Indian River Lagoon and really the water infrastructure projects. I think some of the detractors, I guess, from Amendment 1 want the state to just acquire land. The problem with acquiring land is you have to maintain it and it has to have a purpose. So I think we're much better suited using that money for maintaining the land we currently have, building out water infrastructure, and really building out infrastructure across the entire state. It's probably the best use for that money.
My view is very different. From my perspective, 75% of the voters voted for Amendment 1. It was blatantly violated, in my view. After the governor's veto, we did have $702 million in the pot of money that voters wanted going to land preservation and conservation. About 20% of it went to that. $111 million went to vehicle purchase, $191 million of it went to existing salaries. So in my view, Amendment 1 was blatantly violated. This year, my sign of hope is that Senator Negron and Representative Gail Harrell are trying to change how those monies are allocated, and that's a proposal I'm supporting.
Well, let's see what happens. I know Senator Bob Graham very much hopes that, and a lot of other people who voted for Amendment 1. Representative Trujillo, always good to have you in.
Thank you.
so much.
Rodriguez, thanks a
Appreciate your
million.
time.
Appreciate it. All right, well, we obviously have a lot of this and other things to talk about with our Powerhouse Roundtable, and that is next.
The president on guns, the senator on his high-heeled boots, and the county birthing ferry service to Cuba. It is a full plate for the roundtable today.
And we have a great panel to take that on. Mark Caputo, whom you know, covers Florida politics for Politico, the go-to website for all your political news, and he is the author of the daily Politico Florida Daybook. Good reading.
Marlon Hill is an attorney with Hamilton, Miller, and Berthasol, and also a radio broadcaster.
And welcome back to the Roundtable, Tim Padgett, the Americas correspondent for WLRN Radio, the former Miami bureau chief for Time Magazine. Gentlemen, welcome.
Gentlemen, where are my women today?
It's up to you guys.
You will handle the distaff side perfectly.
Thank you, sir. Well, shall we start with the legislature? You've heard two segments full of what's coming up. Let's talk about the budget first.
Well, here's the big problem you have in
I haven't
Tallahassee.
even asked you a question yet.
Let me tell you the problem you have in Tallahassee. Math. The governor says...
Fuzzy math.
Right. The governor says there's a $1.3 billion surplus, and the legislature says there's $635 million. Right. They're apart 50% or 100%, depending on which perspective you're looking at it. If you can't agree on the numbers, you can't agree on a tax
That's
cut.
where the walnuts come in, where you do the shell game.
Right, and that's one of the things that Rick Scott has been rather expert at. Like, oh, all of the experts and all the economists say that this is A, therefore it's B, so I can get my way. And he's just going to have a problem.
Well, he definitely has to jump in there with the relationship he's going to have with this legislature, which has been his problem. He doesn't have an election to worry about. He really needs to try to dive into some of his relationships, and that is not his strength. And unfortunately, they're going to have some more contention.
Yeah, a lawmaker friend of mine whispered in my ear the other day as he looked at Rick Scott at an event I was at, and he said, "He's kind of a strange dude."
But you have to give the governor due. He said it's all about jobs, and it has been all about
But
jobs.
that's part of the big problem, though, Jenna. That's part of the big problem.
Glenna.
It's too much of a big problem for him focusing on jobs. Yeah. Single-handedly, since he came into office, jobs. There are more issues that are impacting Floridians more than jobs.
Yeah.
Healthcare, criminal justice reform, delivery of social services. He's leading the state. He's not just leading the economy of the state.
And Floridians do care about jobs, but after we've just emerged from the worst recession since the 1930s in this country, I don't think that they're really connecting with his obsession with cutting taxes at every turn. I think they see what sort of the kind of economic thinking that led us to this recession in the first place, and it had a lot to do with that kind of thinking. And I think, as Mark points out, I think they'd rather keep a cushion of a budget surplus and that sort of security feeling up in Tallahassee rather than just, this slash and burn on taxes.
You cannot come to a budget agreement if you can't agree on the bottom line of the budget, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was such a disconnect with all the focus on the gun bills, and no one is talking about the depleting budget for mental health. And I think so many people are looking at those two things and saying those go hand in hand. Mental health funding, mental health social services, and the gun bills, which do not provide any sort of eye toward who can have those guns in their hands on a federal level as well. But in those gun bills, that's just missing.
It is. Florida is a low-tax, low-services state, so it's not news there. We're also the gunshine state. So the idea that they're taking up a gun bill doesn't really surprise me. This legislative session, though, is going to be characterized by some of these fights over guns. If passes prologue, the guns on campus bill is probably going to fail. Open carry is going to be a hard lift, but they really shouldn't accomplish too much. They don't want to accomplish too much. They want to basically pass a budget, get out, and hit the campaign trail.
And on gambling, the bill that the agreement, the compact that the governor has set forward, even though there is, Marlon, local authorization needed, the gambling in Miami-Dade County and to a lesser extent in Broward, mainly in Miami-Dade, would expand big time if voters approved. And you know, if it gets on a ballot, the gambling interests are going to spend
and it's likely to fail
a gazillion dollars.
And it's likely to fail in the legislature as well. I don't think they have the appetite to take it on this year at all.
Yeah.
No.
All right. If we can, let's move away from the legislature. And Tim Padgett, this week you published, I thought, a really excellent op-ed in the Miami Herald on the subject of the 8,000 or so Cubans who are in Costa Rica who are going to be flown starting Tuesday to El Salvador and then put on buses for the U.S. border. And I'll have a report on this later in this program. But you made a very good point about basically the unfairness of this. Why is it unfair?
Well, because what happened this week, or what's going to happen with this airlift of Cubans from Costa Rica through El Salvador and then continue their journey up to the United States, what it really reflects isn't just the Cuban migrant problem we have, but just the dysfunction generally of our immigration system, all the distortions, all the hypocrisies. What you have, as you point out, these 8,000 Cubans stranded in Costa Rica because Nicaragua won't let them in, and they're going to be airlifted then to El Salvador, which we've also found out this week is now the world's deadliest country. It has the highest murder rate on the planet.
Yeah, surpassed Honduras.
Right.
Honduras was #1 now, I guess. It's
and now
El
you
Salvador.
have tens of thousands of Salvadorans who would love to get out of there, save their lives, and get to the United States, but they can't. Now they're going to sit and watch as 8,000 Cubans just sort of get ushered through. And again, as you point out, there's just an unfairness and an insensitivity, really, involved in that whole situation. Right. And it really at the same time, then you've got the Obama administration stepping up its deportations of Central Americans out of the United States, all in 1 week. And it just, as I said, it just sort of points out the glaring hypocrisies of our system.
And this week, Senator Marco Rubio had mentioned that he was going to be drafting a bill that would limit the benefits that Cubans automatically enjoy. And he cited some statistics. Cuban immigrants. Yeah. He cited some instances where Cubans come and they obtain their benefits and take them home. And there are people in Cuba right now who are getting Social Security living in Cuba on the U.S. dime. But it's so interesting to me that the senator has now pivoted on Cuba from an immigration issue to an economic issue.
Welcome to an election year. It's what, about 3 weeks before the Iowa caucuses. The guy
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's the guy who's identified as the immigration reform gang of 8 man in the presidential election suddenly makes an immigration bill that's a crackdown. It is probably a long time coming. It was the South Florida Sun-Sentinel that has done great work on this, showing just how many abuses there are in the system. The defenders of the current policy would state that the Castro dictatorship kind of necessitates that, unlike El Salvador. But I think over time, as more and more people are going down to Cuba and drinking rum and smoking cigars and making a mockery of the embargo, we need to start looking at whether or not this policy is needed.
Can I tell you, I don't think that's a new thing. And I know my first trip to Cuba was in the mid-90s with you. We were in the same trip. And I can't, it was such a...
Pastores para la paz, the pastors for peace.
Exactly.
What
such
a pain in the rear end those guys were. I mean,
for another day.
It's easier to do it now. Yeah.
But that, to me, even in the mid-90s, I met people who were blatantly talking about coming to the United States because they wanted a better life economically. It was not about politics. It was not about freedom. Not that that was not an issue, but it was an economic reason, even back then.
Well, even in an election year, common sense is going to roll into play for the citizens. Voter registration is February 16th. Folks need to get themselves in order in terms of civic engagement. This is where the voters are really going to start tuning in. It's January. Primary coming up in March.
March 15th.
But common sense immigration reform, common sense gun reform, just plain old common sense is going to be needed.
Well, we could use a lot more common sense, and we try to follow that dictate here at Local 10 on This Week in South Florida. We'll be back with the roundtable with more in just a minute. Stay with us. On this Sunday morning, live in our studio, a robust discussion on the roundtable here with Tim Padgett of WLRN, America's correspondent, ace attorney, civic activist Marlon Hill, and Mark Caputo.
Ace.
So
Deuce, maybe.
let me ask about something. I went to a news conference on Thursday, I think it was, where Miami-Dade Mayor Carlos Jimenez said we want to use the land that David Beckham wanted at Port Miami for a soccer stadium. It's a really kind of an underused portion of land there on the southwest side. That's where we want to put a ferry terminal. And guess what? I guess they could go to Cuba, but the mayor went out of his way, Tim, to say, well, we do business with companies, and if they go to Cuba, that's up to them, and that's up to the federal government. I mean, he certainly doesn't want to be seen as the mayor who is going to do business with Cuba.
But there's a contradiction there. Oh, okay, as the mayor of Miami-Dade County, he feels he has to back off any suggestion that South Florida, that the county is doing business directly with Miami. I understand that. But if you ask the vast majority of Cuban Americans here in South Florida if they would be in favor of this kind of service coming out of a very convenient area like that, they would say yes, because ferries offer them so much more, for example, cargo space to take all the stuff that they take down to Cuba and to relatives and businesses, etc.
Unfortunately, Tim, in an election year, not a lot of things are going to sound
exactly.
And it's not just that. Yes, probably a majority of people think that way, but the majority of people who actually vote in a Republican primary and who actually might fund a campaign probably have a different opinion. Another thing is I talked to a businessman who had gone down and had very high-level meetings with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Cuba, and he told me that the Castro regime has let them know in almost no uncertain terms, hey, look, we'll happily do shipping between Havana and Tampa, Havana and New Orleans, Havana and Galveston, but not Miami. They want to punish the Miami Cubans.
But wait a second, why, as far as the ferry service, why is that even a question when there are flights to Cuba from Miami International?
14,000 people a week fly to Cuba on charters from Miami International.
So what's the question?
Carnival Cruise Lines is going to send a cruise ship down there sometime later this year. They're trying.
Key West is definitely hoping for it. Remember, Key West's relationship with Havana is very old. A guy who founded Key West originally, or bought it originally, or was given it by the Spanish crown in the 1820s, was from Havana. So Key West is dying to have that service.
Yeah, well, I did, for the record, speak off the record to a principal in one of the ferry companies, and he confirmed exactly what you said, which is, yeah, before we see service out of Miami, we may see it from Port Everglades, we may see it from Key West, maybe even Miami Beach, but we're not going to, I don't think he said the Cubans do want to punish the Cuban Americans here in Miami.
There's one more question. Back when David Beckham was looking at that spot in the southwest corner, it was too shallow for maritime business.
Yeah, well, they need to dredge 6 or 7 feet. The mayor says they can do it without much environmental concern or permits, and
Of course, it's always safe and nice to dredge places.
Yeah.
There's no silt or any problem.
All right, well, let's
being sarcastic.
before we run out of time, we have to talk presidential politics, and let's begin, if we can, with something really banal and fun, which is Marco Rubio's boots that he wore this week, which were, I guess, all over Twitter and...
All I can say is, thank goodness, someone is talking about the fashion of one of the man candidates this time.
Okay, so what did you think? Let me ask you, what did you think of his boots?
Well, I'm all about boots, as you may know. I have a whole collection. I don't care about his
Were they
boots.
nice? Were they stylish boots or not?
They're all right. I mean, I don't look at him as a style icon, but I don't need to.
The more apt question, Glenna, which Beatle did he look like?
Wait, do you want to hear how this has been described in our favorite way? Take a listen.
Those boots!
I'm glad they don't turn the camera.
They're shagalicious. Look at those things.
You don't get better than shagalicious.
Yeah, I mean,
Point,
he's
set, match.
Joe Scarborough comparing Marco to Austin Powers. I'm not sure entirely why, but...
Well, if I were Marco, I would continue wearing the boots.
He did. I think he had.
No, he stopped when he did an interview with a local TV reporter like a day or two later, actually.
Why are we talking about Marco's boots?
We should also point out that Senator Rubio tonight at the Intercontinental Hotel in Miami, 6 o'clock, has a big fundraiser, and it's first time that I may be there. First time that we have seen Senator Rubio in Florida.
The boots will be on display.
I want a full fashion report.
If I'm there, I will certainly look for it.
I want Tim. What's your footwear today?
Very standard.
We have not talked about Jeb Bush thus far, but I think we have to. And Mark Caputo, the Jeb Army, in fact, Representative Carlos Trujillo, who was here a minute ago, was one of several hundred Jeb devotees who went to New Hampshire this past week to knock on doors and campaign for him. So he's turning out
He's turning out people from Florida, who are longtime supporters in New Hampshire. That's indicative of the problem that Jeb has. He's down. He's not out, but he's down. Jeb's in a hurt locker right now, and how he gets out of that, I don't know. But he's in, if you look at the poll aggregates, basically tied for third place in New Hampshire. If he loses in Iowa and New Hampshire, South Carolina becomes tougher, and it's a general belief that you got to win one of the early 4 primary states.
Right, and just this week I did note that Hank Greenberg, the chairman of AIG, huge company bailed out by the feds in the 90s or early 2000s, he said, yeah, I'm the one who gave $10 million to the Right to Rise PAC, and then he said, and you know what, I've been kind of disappointed in this campaign. So when the biggest contributor to your political action committee says hasn't met my expectations.
But I think that the loyalty within the Jeb Nation is still very deep in regards to, they're going to go all the way. In fact, it may impact the establishment lane of this election that goes into the convention in the summer.
It's deep, but is it wide enough? Is the question.
Wide enough to be impactful as to who rises to challenge.
I think it's narrowing, though. I mean, people like Greenberg, I think they were clinging to Jeb for so long because they felt that once all the Trump and Cruz mania was done, Jeb would be there as the establishment candidate of that, what they call it, the establishment lane. He would still be there, and then the establishment could swoop him up, and he would go on to win the nomination. I don't think that sentiment's there anymore, and I think it's shifting, as you and I were discussing earlier, maybe shifting to Marco Rubio now.
I just wish I could disappoint a millionaire and get $10 million. That would be fantastic.
We'll put you on the list, but...
reinvest it in the Powerball.
Well, that certainly got everybody's attention this week. We're positively giddy over it, but you know, how often you have a possibility of winning $950 million?
Anybody here play?
How much?
My wife bought her ticket last night, yeah.
Sorry.
I hate losing so badly that it hurts to part with that dollar knowing I'm not going to win, but I think I'm going to be forced into doing it.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for coming in. Next week we will balance the male-gender disparity here, Glenna. But
thank you. Although you're a fun bunch. I love you.
You did a great job. All right, stay with us next. A report on that, well, they said on the
Cubans in Costa Rica.
Thank you very much.
Tuesday is a big day for them.
The Cubans in Costa Rica moving on to Salvador and the United States.
Have been talking about this morning, the gridlock has been broken for thousands of Cuban migrants stranded in Costa Rica.
Starting on Tuesday, the first group is going to be flown to El Salvador and then bused to the U.S. border. That has some local mayors, emergency managers, and school district administrators very worried about a possible new tidal wave of refugees winding up here. Cubans who have been stranded in Costa Rica will start moving out next Tuesday. The first plane load of 180 people, mostly families, will fly to El Salvador and from there board buses to the U.S. border and eventually, for many, Miami.
So what we're talking about here really is a controlled event, and there are steps in place, there are plans in place and processes for the processing of Cuban entrants into this country and their placement.
The stranded Cuban migrants, about 8,000 of them, have been stuck in Costa Rica for weeks, unable to get past the Nicaraguan border. Starting next week, they will be flown up here to El Salvador and from there put on buses and taken all the way up to the U.S.-Mexican border, probably at El Paso. The trip won't be cheap. The Costa Rica Cubans will be charged $550 per person for the plane ticket and bus ride. Many sold everything they own just to get this far.
How many of that 8,000 have the funds to be able to pay for something like that is a big question.
No deben tener, no creo que reciben paso libre a este país.
Former Governor Jeb Bush recently said Cubans stuck in Costa Rica should not be given free entry into the U.S. And Senator Marco Rubio told reporters yesterday the Cuban migrants in Costa Rica should not be allowed into the U.S. But in 2015, more than 40,000 Cubans crossed into the U.S. at the border with Mexico. Thousands more came by sea in makeshift rafts and boats. And on Friday, the Coast Guard here reported picking up and returning 216 Cubans this week alone. They are leaving the island, Glenna, in droves, afraid that the Cuban Adjustment Act that gives them the guaranteed entry is going to be wiped off the books.
Stay tuned. A lot going on. When we come back, a little-known bill bringing attention to a big criminal justice issue. The chilling effect of fear on justice is next. This is a live look from our Miami Tower Cam. Kind of a cloudy Sunday.
Right. No tennis for me, I don't think, later. But anyway, let's get the official forecast from our meteorologist, Jennifer Correa. Jennifer, what's going on?
Good afternoon. Well, we're seeing a lot of showers passing through the area. They're quick. That's the good news. But let's start off quickly. We're heading south to north. So the Lower Keys, Saddle Bunch Keys, Big Pine Key, you'll be dealing with some heavy rain in the next 30 minutes. Also scattered showers draping from southeastern Miami-Dade all along the coast up to Aventura, Hollywood, Fort Lauderdale, right along the beach, A1A. If you were at the beach, you are out of the sand because it is pouring. Now, this is out ahead of the cold front. As far as the rain chances go after this round, well, they start to diminish. We'll be left over with a lot of cloud cover into tomorrow morning. But with that said, we still drop into those low 60s. Tomorrow's high, only 72 degrees. Let's get right to that 7-day forecast. Rain chances do go down tomorrow. With that said, we could still have some light drizzles this evening. But dry tomorrow, and then rain comes back Tuesday. Glenna.
Jennifer, thanks. With all the focus on guns and gambling and the governor's budget as the state legislative session opens this week, you may not have heard about House Bill 475. Unless you or your family has been the victim of a violent crime, in which case you may have a vested interest in it. It and a companion bill in the state Senate would shield the identities of criminal witnesses from the public record.
And we believe that if we help shield the identifying information of a witness, that will encourage people to come forward.
That was State Rep Cynthia Stafford at a town hall meeting this week, but the bill was actually filed by a first-term Democrat from Tampa, where they apparently face South Florida's sad and scary problem. That is, the people who know the ones who did it, be it the drive-by, the murder, usually of someone young, sometimes an innocent bystander, they are scared into silence, sure that when they become a snitch, they become a target. We have covered those cases, the murders with many witnesses but no leads, the charges that prosecutors drop when the important witness recants, or worse, disappears. Florida public records laws have relatively few exemptions, aka government in the sunshine. Exceptions are made when safety may be at stake, as in the case of the personal information of law enforcement officers. Worth it to note, exemptions have been increasing. There are now more than 1,000, according to the First Amendment Foundation. That foundation is the most vocal opponent to this bill so far. In a letter to the bill's sponsor last month, its president calls it too broad, too vague, antithetical to the criminal justice system, and questions the need for it as speculative. Beyond that, think about this. Those in fear are probably more worried about word on the street than in any public record. Still, even if it goes nowhere, House Bill 475 will bring statewide attention to one of South Florida's most serious criminal justice issues, the chilling effect of fear on justice. So, what do you think? We welcome your take on any topic you like that's in the news or not.
Weigh in by email, Facebook, Twitter, any of these addresses. We're easy to find, and we love hearing from you. Remember, as always, stay informed, get involved.
And have a beautiful Sunday. No tennis for you today?
No tennis.